Hi everyone, I'm recording this from home. I got home and realized there were a few questions that I hadn't had time to respond to that I think would be helpful for people at later points in their practice. There were a few other technical instructions that also I think would be helpful for most people at some point or other as they go forward with jhana practice, and a couple of general things. Most of what I want to go into kind of falls into the category, not all of it, but most of it kind of falls into the category of working in sort of grey areas, jhanic grey areas. So, as I mentioned, sometimes when the jhana opens, for the first few experiences, very intense, very clear, seemingly effortless. One's very much in the jhana and might feel like there's nothing to do, nothing to improve on even. And as one gains more experience in and out of that jhana and gets more familiar with that particular jhanic territory, whichever it is, whatever jhana we're talking about, then there do appear times where it becomes apparent in one's practice that sometimes it's very clear, very pure, if you like, a pure jhanic experience. Other times we're sort of in the jhanic territory, but not quite, sort of para-jhanic territory, or kind of half in, half out, or on the edge, or as I mentioned, we're mostly in, but some very subtle hindrances are kind of yapping quietly at the borders of consciousness, or there's an area of the body that won't clear up, or these kinds of things. There's many things, but it falls into that kind of territory, the grey area, working in the grey areas or transitional states. Not everything, but a lot of things. Before that, though, there's a couple of general things. And then something about soulmaking in jhana. So let's see how we do. So first general thing is, again, to make clear that I would say it's more optimal for the way we're practicing jhanas to not fall into a sort of strict, unbroken rhythm of formal practice, sit, walk, 45 minutes, 1 hour, whatever, however it's divided up. Of course, sometimes that will feel like it's the most helpful rhythm at that time, but the key thing here is, does it feel like it is? Again, am I listening? Am I being responsive? Am I being attentive? Am I tuning my practice rhythm at the moment, right now, not for this retreat, but right now, for this morning, or whatever it is, or this afternoon, or this evening? Am I tuning it to what feels best, what feels like it's actually most fertile? So, sometimes if you sit and the jhana's coming and it all feels really good, you can go way beyond 1 hour, way beyond. Just sit in an unlimited way. You run out of batteries, try again. Try to get the jhana again without getting up. Maybe 2 or 3 times. Sit as long as you can. Not with any forcing, but just sit as long as it works, as long as it feels good. And the same with walking practice, and the same with standing practice. Unless for some reason you only have 20 minutes or 40 minutes or whatever it is. I know I'll just go 40 minutes to walk now, or whatever. And that's all fine. But basically there needs to be this responsive attunement of the rhythms of our practice. And we're really finding out, feeling into, getting a sense for, and finding out what's the most helpful right now. And breaking out of a kind of rigid, tight, predefined, preset mold of a rhythm. For practice, for different postures. This is also part, as I mentioned, because the day needs to breathe, and there needs to be space for appreciation and beauty and a little bit of exercise and open-heartedness and all that. So I'm reiterating that, but I also want to say that when some of you will start exploring insight ways of looking as a sort of huge stream of investigation in your practice, and when that opens up, I would say the same principle applies there. You can have times where it's sit, walk, very kind of rigid and predefined. That's absolutely fine. But you also really want times where it's this more fluid, attentive, open scheduling that's much more responsive. Because again there, in the way that I would, or the way I most commonly teach insight practice, which is through different insight ways of looking, learning them, employing them, seeing what happens with them. Again, we still want that. We still want the day to breathe. We still want space in the heart and the soul for appreciation and beauty and to be touched, and the open-heartedness. We also need space to notice the after effects on perception. So whether we're doing jhanic practice as it goes deeper and they become more common and we know to look for them and look out for them very gently without pressure, but also in insight ways of looking practice. Again, very potentially very powerful, very noticeable after effects on perception there as well. But there's another reason when we come to insight ways of looking, or practicing insight ways of looking, is that partly the way that process works in this way of teaching insight meditation it's not through the continuity, through the accumulation of a sort of power of mindfulness, through just being completely continuous with the mindfulness. So sit, walk, unbroken, go to lunch, continue the mindfulness. It's a great way of practice, and a certain intensity and continuity of mindfulness will be developed hopefully that way, and through that continuity of mindfulness it can illuminate certain things. And so that's great, but an alternative way of going about things is when we practice, and actually deliberately practicing different insight ways of looking, then I actually need the comparison. So I need to practice this insight way of looking, and then actually, in a way, let it go, and compare the difference in perception when I let it go. Now I'm just back to a normal consciousness. I'm not particularly trying to, of course there's a way of looking, because there's always a way of looking, but I'm not particularly trying this or that way of looking. And it's through the comparison that I learn about the dependent arising. Yes, I'm not trying to accumulate so much mindfulness that I then perceive the truth, because there isn't one truth. I'm practicing a way of looking, and then I let go of practicing that way of looking, because then when I practice the way of looking, I notice what it does to perception. I notice the sense of things. When I stop practicing, I notice a different sense of things. So in a way, we actually need a looser, or rather less continuous schedule of practice, or intention of practice. It can be continuous for a long period, absolutely fine, but it does need some kind of coming out of the insight way of looking, and maybe just going into a more normal consciousness without a deliberate intention, so that we can see through comparison the effect of the insight way of looking. So it's not that it always has to be like that, but sometimes that's part of it too. There's less of this emphasis on continuity. I see when I practice this insight way of looking, I should see in 10 minutes, in 20 minutes, in an hour, whatever it is, it should be obvious what's happening there. Obvious its effects on perception. Okay, so that's one general thing. A second general thing is about posture, and I mentioned on the retreat, eventually you can kind of access jhana and even stay in a jhana in almost any posture. Posture becomes very, very not important. But before that time, before the practice has really ripened to that stage, posture is actually very important, particularly at the beginning. And I was encouraging in some of the early guided meditations, etc., really to sense in to the poise and the balance in the posture, and see if you can get a feel for, a sense for the beauty in the posture, the beauty, the dignity, the nobility that is reflected in the balance between the chitta qualities that the posture manifests, expresses, reflects, between openness, relaxation, softness, and between brightness, alertness, poise and intention on the other hand. But also just the sense of actual balance in the posture and the actual way that the mind, when it encompasses the whole body and includes the whole body space in a very alert, open, receptive, sensitive way, that the body, the posture is actually very, very subtly affected. And subtle changes in the posture can affect our ability to have that kind of pervasive energy body awareness. So this is really, really important. If you're not familiar with this, it's really, as I said at the beginning of the retreat, it's really, really worth taking a little time to play with. I remember actually Kirsten showing me a picture of her very young nieces, just 3 or 4 nieces, can't remember, meditating or sort of trying to meditate. They're very, very young, and between, I think, 2 and 10 or something, their ages. But one of them, it was very interesting, and it was quite a young one. You could tell from the photograph that her awareness was spread throughout her body. They were all sitting cross-legged and sort of copying Kirsten kind of thing with their eyes shut. But the awareness was spread through the whole body, and you could feel from the photograph the poise in the posture, but also in the attention, in the awareness. And you could feel the quality of the attention and that it pervaded her whole body. And it was very alive and right there. It's quite interesting. Posture and chitta quality go very much together at first, and it's really worth playing with that if you're not familiar with it. I remember one of my first teachers in an interview, it was many, many years ago, and I got called in for an interview. I think I was one of the first people. They would call you in for interviews on these retreats, and I was one of the first people to get called in. I thought, oh, why am I first? And he said, I was a teenager, and he said, you're very out of contact with the earth, or something like that. Very out of contact with the ground. I had no idea what he was talking about, but it struck me as being, really a problem. It sounded like a very serious ailment. And so he got me to sit and played with my posture a little bit, and at a certain point, he just said, there. And I was not really in contact with my body at all back then. I had no training in that. I was probably pretty disconnected, as probably most teenagers in that generation were disconnected from my body. But he just said, there. So he was just gently moving my shoulders and my torso, and then he said, there. And really, it wasn't so much a visible kind of yoga-looking posture that he was responding to. He was feeling the way my posture helped my mind kind of inhabit the whole body space in a very natural and open and upright and alert way. And I think that's what he was picking up on. Of course, to me, it just seemed like some kind of supernatural powers at the time. Now that I'm much more used to all this, and teaching and energy body is very much what I emphasize, I can easily understand how it's possible to have that kind of awareness with another person, how their mind and body are right now, and how their energy body awareness is, and how the posture is perhaps allowing, supporting, or limiting certain possibilities psychically, certain possibilities for the chitta, or certain possibilities in relationship. I remember working with someone in an interview, and they were in a very difficult space in their heart and mind and soul, and was asking them to come into presence, to be in relationship with me, with the open heart and the sort of holding there. But I could tell that, and encourage them to open to their body experience as well. But I could tell that there was just something very, very subtle in how they were sitting and holding their posture. So it didn't look like, certainly nothing like being hunched over or contracted or some kind of obviously defensive posture. It was extremely subtle. But that was enough to prevent her from coming into a different relationship with herself, but also coming into a different relationship with me. And we played with that just a little bit, and it allowed the relational space, both with herself and with myself, to open up to possibilities that were just not available 2 minutes beforehand, 5 minutes beforehand. She had no idea. No idea. So the mind, the chitta, affects the body and the posture affects the chitta. And this goes very, very subtle and deep until it begins to be the states of openness and states of jhana, states of samadhi and all that, and become much more familiar, and they're less dependent on the posture being like this or like that to enable them. But maybe for quite a while for some people it is quite posture dependent, so it's really worth taking the time to play with posture, even in kind of almost what might seem like microscopically subtle ways. That was part of what I was trying to encourage at the beginning of the retreat. Okay, so let's run through a few more specific technical things. As I said, most of these are relative to things kind of going well, but hitting some tricky spots where it's just not quite coalescing or coming together. So we spoke about, sometimes there can be pain, obviously, or discomfort in the body, or a sense of contraction or holding or tightness somewhere in the energy body, the physical body. And we spoke about the possibility of actually taking that difficult spot and, for example, if you're doing metta practice as your base practice, actually imagining the center of the metta there. The metta is radiating from that very difficulty. Or imagining the breath coming in and out there, or the energy, that being the center of the energy body and the center of the breath energy, if you like, or the center of the light, the white luminosity or golden white luminosity that might pervade the energy body, and just almost exactly where you'd least expect it, imagining that to be the center of what you're trying to encourage. And sometimes it can turn out, just as we'd least expect, counterintuitively to be the loveliest place. But what I want to add now is similarly that if the mind is fuzzy or foggy or woolly, the mind, the head, and if you're tired, a similar thing can work. Imagine light there in the head. The head feels dull, or there's that kind of tiredness behind the eyes, or just the kind of woolliness there. Imagine the light centered there, if you're working with light as part of the energy body awareness. Imagine the breath energy coming in and out there, or coming in or out through the top of the head, through there, the sides, the front, the back, whatever it is, or radiating, expanding out from that very woolliness. So just the same principle, but applied to qualities of the chitta. Same principle as we suggested with regard to bodily discomforts or blocks, we can apply to discomforts or blocks in the chitta, and often they do feel in the head. So we just imagine them in the head. So some of these are quite basic. Some will apply to working in the territory of any. Some apply to later jhanas, and I'll go into that. A specific jhana. Some of them apply to working outside of a jhana before, even in jhanic territory. Or, as I said, the jhana's kind of going okay, but there's a little bit that's not kind of brought into the fold of the jhana. It hasn't spread there. So some of these things will apply at any level. And we just mentioned pain. So again, we mentioned on the retreat, there might be, again, it could be any jhana, say second or first or whatever. The jhanic nimitta is there. I'm in the territory of the jhana, but it's not quite suffusing the whole body. And indeed, there's some place in the body where there's pain or discomfort. So it's in the jhanic territory. The nimitta has arisen, but it's not. I'm not fully suffused. It's not fully suffused, and I'm not fully absorbed. Well, it's not always best to hurry to spread or suffuse the nimitta. That may be exactly the right thing, but sometimes just pause a little bit, because we've got a few options. Sometimes it may be, just go ahead, try and spread it in the ways that we listed, the possible methods of spreading the nimitta through the bodily space to pervade and permeate, as the Buddha says, suffuse and saturate the whole body space. Sometimes that's the best thing to do, and just go ahead and do that. Sometimes, though, don't rush to do that. Stay enjoying where it's okay first. Find those okay places where there is piti, where there is the sense of happiness if you're working in the second jhana. Stay there, enjoy that more first before you think about spreading. Sometimes just in the staying and enjoying it will spread, as we said on the retreat. And then there are other options too. We talked about playing with perception. Many of you had a lot of success with that. There's pain, there's discomfort. Can I actually just imagine it? Begin to see it, play with the perception, the malleability of the citta, of the perception, of the way of looking, and see this pain, see this discomfort as piti or as sukha or as stillness or whatever the jhanic nimitta is that's possible to have there when we change the perception. But basically there's different options. We don't always need to rush to try and suffuse as the first option. But they're all good. Sometimes we might be something specific to the second jhana. We might be working in the second jhana and we've known very effusive happiness and intense happiness and really grinning for hours on end, almost so that the face hurts afterwards. Other times experiences with the jhana less intense happiness or something else. So for instance, one might be in the second jhana, but it's not quite stabilized. Something about it feels a bit flimsy. Well, it may need a bit more body in it, a bit more, put body in inverted commas, a bit more piti. Maybe need a bit more of that kind of body energy, body awareness. So what you can do, you're working in the second jhana, but it's a bit flimsy, it's a bit weak somehow, it's not quite stabilized perhaps. There could be any of those issues. And then you can just dip back to the first jhana. What you're effectively doing is mixing more piti and more body pleasure in. And just dip back. It could be for a few moments, it could be for a few minutes. Sometimes these things work just for a few minutes. Just dip back, get more body in the experience, more piti, and then come back and see how the second jhana goes. So this is actually, we can broaden this and actually extend it to make a more general principle. So again, we're talking about when there has been lots of really clear, deep, pure experiences of a certain jhana, and as you're working more, trying to marinate and develop mastery with that jhana, you're in and out, getting very familiar, and sometimes it doesn't go so well, it doesn't stabilize, or it's hard to enter it fully on certain occasions. So, if that's the case with a certain jhana, whichever jhana it is, you can, in order to stabilize it or to enter more fully, sometimes, apart from just working in all the ways we've talked about with sasi and all that, sometimes it can help to go back, as we just discussed, from the second jhana to the first, but this could be fourth to the third, or whichever jhana. Just go back one step, or if you already know the jhana ahead, if you've already got familiar with the jhana ahead, so say today let's say I know 4 jhanas, but right now I'm working on the third jhana. Well, I can, and it's not quite stabilizing, I can't quite enter it fully, I could just dip back to the second jhana. It might be for really a few moments, or longer. Or I could go to the fourth jhana if I already know it. I skip forward. It's the opposite of what I assume. I say, it's not going well, I'd better go to a simpler level. But sometimes I go further to the fourth jhana. Again, it might just be for a few moments, literally dipping the citta and the body in for a few moments and then coming out, or it could be longer, a few minutes even. Or, if you're trying to stabilize and deepen the fourth and it's not going so well, but you're familiar with it, could go back to the third or to one of the formless realms and then back to the fourth. Okay. So there's a general principle here. Skillful working when things feel like they're not going so well on those occasions. And they're still going well, but they're not they could be better. I mentioned, so here's one thing particular to the third jhana. I mentioned that sometimes what happens at this level is that the breath becomes in the stillness that emerges at the third jhana. It's like it allows the breath to perhaps become sensible again. In all the piti and the sukha, it might be that we haven't noticed the breath. We've let the breath go. The piti and sukha have become the primary nimittas, which is a completely fine way of working, as we've emphasized. But sometimes, not only does the breath organically, naturally become more sensible because there's more calmness, sometimes as well, it may actually help the third jhana to bring back an attention to the breath. And at this point, the breath should be very, very subtle, very, very delicate. And like we said, it's the very movement of the breath is peacefulness. The very movement of the breath there, subtle, delicate, gentle breath, is peacefulness, like those strands of seaweed in the lagoon, just gently it's so subtle, they're swaying peacefully. There's movement of the breath, but the very movement is peacefulness. And so sometimes deliberately coming back to find the breath again. It may emerge, as I said, just organically we begin to notice it and include it, or sometimes that can help deepen and consolidate the third jhana if you feel like you need it. Again, and this is a more general point, particularly as we go into the deeper jhanas and we have a sense of secondary nimittas, which we've talked about. So, for instance, the secondary nimittas just of release and relief. These are, I think, important ingredients of the jhanic mix, and any experienced jhana meditator will notice these things, and should notice these things. And so they're not primary nimittas, but sometimes noticing them. So again, I'm working in a jhana, it's not quite coming together. I'm definitely in the territory, but it's just not quite coalescing, not quite fully getting into it as much as I know is possible. So sometimes actually then beginning just very gently, very delicately, without any pressure, just looking for the secondary nimittas, say, of relief and release. And noticing them, and just for a little bit, focusing on them and enjoying them, even just for a few moments, that can allow the whole jhana to deepen or consolidate like that. So that's also a very skillful, sort of subtle movement of the attention. We're working, what will help here? It's almost like we're taking that relief and release, or whatever the secondary nimitta is, and kind of using it as part of the glue, part of the stitching, to help cohere the jhanic experience at that point. So we talked now something particular to the fourth jhana. We talked about oftentimes there is a brightness there, white golden light, and that's quite central. The stillness is the light is the stillness. Sometimes that can feel like a kind of vertical column of bright stillness through the center of the body space. Sometimes it can feel all around you. Sometimes it can be this, it's not quite all around you yet, and there's just, or one can imagine this vertical column of bright white light that is the stillness. The stillness is the light is the stillness. And it's right up through the center of the energy body space. And one can begin to allow that, or even encourage that light to melt outwards from that central vertical column, and in doing so it kind of dissolves the body into it. It dissolves the body with it. So that can be really, really helpful at times. Other times, with different jhanas, but this may be useful with the fourth jhana, particularly again when that kind of leaning forward, or if that leaning forward occurs in the fourth jhana, with this sort of for whatever reasons. We discussed a few possibilities there, but the intensity of the focus and conceiving of the stillness and the nimitta in front of us. Sometimes it's really helpful to feel that you, or the body, or the energy body, is kind of falling backwards into a jhanic realm. Again, you conceive it backwards, but in addition to just conceiving it behind you, you actually also fall back into it. In a way, again, you're working differently with the attention. It's a different mode of attention to be probing forwards or trying to penetrate something in front of me, than it is to fall backwards. And that's different from something within me, this vertical column that I'm expanding outwards. So there's we talked about different modes of attention, different conceptions of kind of the directionality of the attention. The same thing with the jhana in relation to the nimitta, and the whole body in relation to the jhanic nimitta. Okay, so one other thing about the fourth jhana, we mentioned when we talked about the Buddha's description, what's left is nothing but this pure, bright awareness, wrapped in this cloth of pure, bright awareness was his description of the fourth jhana. And then we talked at other times about kind of the idea of mixing cooking ingredients to move between jhanas. So I kind of mentioned this, so it's just an extension of a point I've already made on the retreat. If I can turn up the sense of presence in the fourth jhana, and that will take me, because presence is consciousness is presence, so to speak, turning up that sense of presence. So rather than stillness, I said a different perspective on the fourth jhana is to notice the sense of presence, and that will take me to the sixth jhana, the infinite consciousness. It will begin to open that up. It's already there. The fourth jhana is already pregnant with it. It's already implicit in the fourth jhana. But another way you can think of this is kind of like with those cooking ingredients. I mix a bit of this, add a bit of more of this ingredient to this jhana, and it will take me to another jhana. So really we can say we're adding more presence to the fourth jhana, adding even more. But how are we adding it? By tuning to what's already there. So here it's different than cooking. The tuning to the sense of presence, again, when I notice it, when I tune to it, it amplifies it. So effectively I'm adding more of that particular ingredient into my cooking pot, and the fourth jhana will then change into the sixth jhana. I've turned up the sense of presence just by tuning to it and amplifying it. The tuning to it does amplify it, and that turns up, and it goes to the sixth jhana. Anyway, of course, there should be, as I mentioned, a very strong sense of presence in the fourth jhana. It's almost spellbound. The mind is spellbound, but still we can increase things, and by tuning to them, increase certain factors within the jhana, and then that can sometimes just help that jhana consolidate. As I said, often it's very common for fourth jhana with a lot of experience to get just a little bit dull. So just turn up that sense of presence. But if I really then tune into the sense of presence and hone in on that, I'm amplifying it, and that can take me to the sixth jhana. One thing I mentioned that the Buddha says, technically the breath stops in the fourth jhana. Whatever we think about the so-called biological reality of that will be the meditator's experience. It's hard to locate a sense of breath in the fourth jhana. It feels as if the body has stopped breathing. But be careful, don't try to assess, is this the fourth jhana, by keeping on checking whether your breath has stopped. That's not the right way it's not going to be helpful. Just as checking whether thought has stopped, I said, that's not going to be a helpful way of checking whether you're in the second jhana. Doing that kind of thing, checking my breath, has it stopped? No, it hasn't stopped yet. That's this, in a way, it's kind of reinforcing that pattern that I talked about, this micro pattern in our psychology, micro pattern in the chitta, the sankharas of the mind, to just give attention to the negative, to look for what's not quite right, what's not quite measuring up. Rather, just get into the stillness. The stillness is there. Am I in the fourth jhana yet? Just get into the stillness. Really enjoy it. Really be with it with a very alive attention. Really see if you can penetrate into that stillness. See if you can dissolve into that stillness. If that stillness can dissolve into you. The mind, the body dissolving into the stillness dissolving into and dissolving the mind and body. And that's what we need to do, and it will mature into the fourth jhana if there's that alive attention and that kind of right attention with it, rather than just keep checking whether the breath has stopped. Someone wrote me a note, actually, I mentioned this about breath. So this person was obviously working around the territory of the second jhana, I'm guessing from the note, seems very clear. It's a quick and possibly silly question. Does it matter if the breathing is through the nose or the mouth? A combination of a cold plus an enormous grin, indicates probably the second jhana, open-mouthed, means I sometimes breathe through the mouth. So she had a cold, and there was this enormous grin, and so she finds herself breathing through the mouth. But then she says, and sometimes it feels like it dissipates the strength of piti or sukha. Breathing through the mouth actually dissipated the piti or the sukha. So I would say, if it's from the grin, you don't have to stop your grin. Grinning is good and fine. But probably it's the case that you can just very minutely almost move the position of your tongue against your teeth. And that will somehow allow you to keep grinning without the mouth actually being open. And then you can breathe through your nose, so that we can have a full grin. I think, pretty sure, if the tongue is in a certain position, we should be able to breathe through the nose. Because it may well be that when we breathe through the mouth, in fact it often is, when we breathe through the mouth, the breath isn't allowed to become more subtle. So what the Buddha calls the bodily formations, the breath, are not allowed to become more subtle. And with that, the chitta is kind of, it's harder for the chitta to become more subtle. And if we're trying to be in jhana, as I said, it's characterized by refinement of body energy awareness and body energy vibration, and the refinement, the subtlety of the chitta. You have to be there for jhana. So if we're getting in the way by breathing through the mouth, that keeps the breath unsubtle, then it can be a problem. So if it's possible, if it's not because of the cold, if it's just because of the grin, there's probably things one can do with the tongue to start with. It allows breathing through the nose, and then maybe, if one is ready anyway, it goes beyond the second jhana. One can continue with the nose breath, and the whole thing gets more subtle. If it's a cold, or a bad cold, well, you'll probably just have to breathe through the mouth and put up with it for a while. However, as the chitta gets more subtle, if it can, and it's still, it's not completely prevented by breathing through the mouth at all. It's not complete. That won't completely block things. But you should find, as the chitta gets more subtle, the breath will get more subtle. And then even with a heavy cold, so this might even take, avoiding the breath at first, going via what you remember of energy body vibrations of different states, of different jhanic states, or just remembering a jhana. But if you get in the territory where the chitta is subtle, then the breath will become subtle. Again, body affects mind, breath affects mind, mind affects body and breath. So if the chitta can be kind of just helped to become more subtle, even if we have a bad cold and we're breathing through the mouth, the breath will become more subtle. And because the breath is more subtle, actually less air is being moved. And less air being moved, you might find actually that even with a relatively blocked nose, a quiet blocked nose, you can actually still breathe through the nose, because we're not actually moving that much air. And the little amount of air can find its way through the blocked nose. But it's not that we're trying to make that happen, it's just that we're helping the chitta to become, or allowing the chitta to become more subtle. Naturally that allows the breath to become more subtle, and effortlessly we will probably find that we're breathing through the nose, or nose breathing is happening, without us kind of trying to manipulate that physically. Okay, couple of things, just to finish, two more things. One is, so we talked on the last night about insight ways of looking that unfabricate and that potentially move through the jhanic stages in their process of unfabricating. However, I don't think in that practice the primary point or the primary aim is to necessarily learn a degree of skill that controls an insight way of looking to the degree that I can kind of stop the elevator exactly where I want to an exact jhana. That's a good skill, but it's not the most important thing there. What's much more important, and this is important to understand, what's much more important is that in that process of playing with insight ways of looking, we understand the principle of lessening fabrication. We understand the principle of unfabricating to whatever degree. Through this insight way of looking, there's less clinging, and because there's less clinging, there's more letting go, which is just saying the same thing. And because of that, because of dependent arising, there's less fabrication, and so the experience opens up, refines out in these different ways. So understanding that principle of lessening fabrication through insight ways of looking is really, really important. Understanding how to fabricate less, and thirdly, understanding what exactly is involved in subtle clinging. So I use this word clinging, I said, in a very stretchy way. It means all the way from the most gross to the most subtle aspects of the relationship of the chitta with phenomenal experience that we wouldn't usually think of as clinging. Really, really subtle. So that in the end, even avidya, in the Mahayana, even avidya, even ignorance, is a kind of clinging. Even believing, looking at something and the unconscious belief that it inherently exists, which is what most human beings do most of the time, most of their lives, with most of phenomenal experience. Just that unconscious, unnoticed, very common belief and assumption in the inherent existence of whatever is in perception, in consciousness at any time. We could call that avidya, but in the Mahayana they also call it clinging. It's a very subtle level of clinging, and I use clinging in that sense too. So understanding the principle of lessening fabrication through insight ways of looking. Secondly, how do I fabricate less? How actually using these insight ways of looking and getting familiar with them and developing the art and skill of them. And thirdly, what exactly is going on here? What exactly is involved in subtle clinging? What subtle clinging is being let go of here? And what avidya is being let go of here? So avidya has a whole range of aspects, but also levels to it, from very, very gross, of course, complete deluded thinking, etc., to very, very subtle and clinging as well. So what exactly is involved in subtle clinging, subtle avidya, if that's what we're talking about? And lastly, fourth thing, to understand the implications of all that. The implications of the way less clinging, less avidya fabricates, results in less fabrication right then in the moment of looking, in the moment of relating, a way of looking. In other words, understanding dependent arising and emptiness, as we touched on to some extent in the retreat. So those understandings, those four understandings, are much more the point than being able to control and kind of just I'll be able to exactly go to this jhana and not overstep it to the next jhana or whatever when I unfabricate through a certain insight way of looking. So as always, the insight is more important than the samadhic experience. Okay, last thing, I want to read to you a fairly long note from someone on And this is quite important, and for those of you that are familiar with soulmaking, it's very important. For those of you who are not yet familiar with soulmaking Dharma, but who may be one day familiar with soulmaking Dharma, it may well be very important. So it's a little bit involved, and it's a slightly long note, but I feel it's really, really crucial. And it also expands our sense of how we might go about jhana practice, especially when we have some soul-making background, soul-making Dharma and soul-making practice background. So, this person wrote, "This has been a dukkha-full retreat for me, lots of dukkha, so much pain and struggle around desire and sustaining intention and effort. As always, I asked for permission to share this note, as always, and that was fine with her. So, for me, so much pain and struggle around desire and sustaining intention and effort, the kind of things we were addressing and talking about and trying to open up and inquire into it several times on the retreat." And so she continues, "Your teaching on desire and soul-making the last few nights finally prompted me to try to go into the dukkha last night, to hold and sense it with soul, and to see what images of the path and the self on it, images of the path and images of the self on the path might arise. There were several beautiful and meaningful images that came from sensing the dukkha like this, and that felt like they began to clarify what I want from practice, and to give non-pathologizing place to some long-standing and painful patterns in my life. I won't go into this now. What I want to say is that later on last night there was a lot of frustration around, and I felt some confidence from the above-mentioned experience about going in through the dukkha. So as skillfully as possible, I let the frustration rip, naming all the smallnesses and solidities in myself that I'm utterly sick of, tuning to the power rather than the poison of this emotion or energy." We talked about that as well in the retreat at some point. "I didn't sense self-judgment in it, just clarity and fire." It's really, really important, this. "Out of this, a sense of space opened. And in that space, as I was breathing, I became aware of a very subtle sense of the energy body breathing with me. This was the language that came, and it had soul resonances. My sense of the energy body was that they, the energy body, were creatively and definitely other than me." So rather than I am the energy body, or it's me, or it's part of me, the sense was that they were definitely creatively and definitely other than me. So we talk about two-ness in soul-making practice sometimes. "They were taking up a space somewhat larger than my physical body, though overlapping with it, and I had a strong sense of their autonomy and intelligence. I've not really worked with energy body as image, rather than as the terrain in which image and sensitivity to image arise, but I've heard you speak to this possibility, so I really tried to lean into it, using the nodes of the lattice to tune and sense, and what opened was a gorgeous sense of two-ness with the energy body, and a sense that they, the energy body, were taking me under their wing, teaching me how to be in the right relationship with them. I would say that my relationship with piti on this retreat, and in general, has been pretty dysfunctional, tight with self and grasping and aversion. When piti arose in this experience with the energy body last night, though, it felt like they, the energy body, were giving it to me. They were giving it to me, saying, 'Here, try feeling this,' and holding it for me while I worked and played, taking the pressure off and coaching me to try different things. I found I could stay with intensities and subtleties I hadn't been able to stay with before, because now they were being given to me as gift by this beautiful, unfathomable other. It was freeing and energizing and humbling. So I'd be interested to hear any thoughts you have, and specifically around allowing or inviting a sense of imaginal other into the base practice. In some ways, what unfolded wasn't all that different from the energy body-based practices you outlined on this retreat, but there was a strong sense of being in two-ness with mysterious otherness that ignited and aligned my desire, intention and effort, where they've been quite confused or limp, through much of this retreat. I still feel very far from jhana, but I feel like I've begun to see the possibility of writing something in relation to why and how I practice. Thank you for reading all this. I'm sorry it's so long. And then a PS. Actually, a couple more thoughts around intention. My intention in working with the frustration was for soul-making rather than samadhi. It was a surprise to me when the piti arose, and even when it did, I'd say the intention continued to be predominantly for soul-making, for the beauty of that dimensional relationship with the energy body. In subsequent sittings, with the intention for samadhi, so she returned to the intention for samadhi, I've tried to invite that imaginal sense of the energy body, but they haven't come. So perhaps it's that this soulful experience with the energy body now becomes part of the fantasy operating in the background of samadhi practice. That was one of the options, if you remember, that I talked about. We work with an image and then it goes into the background as a fantasy and helps support things. Or, she continues, or I can choose to pick it up more intentionally in soul-making practice, ? So I didn't have time, but I wrote a quick note back to her and suggested she did the second of those options. Choose to pick it up more intentionally as a soul-making practice, with the intention for soul-making, not for samadhi. So something had happened here for good reason, some difficulty, some knots over the time around intention and desire and goal. And those things that we were dwelling on and returning to several times in the retreat. So much importance, so much need to give careful attention to that, to inquire into that, to find right relationship with desire, intention, goal, aim, direction. So a kind of a long-standing history of dukkha and entanglement and difficulty there. So actually, my sense was here, much, much more helpful, stay with the soul-making. Look, something extremely important and extremely beautiful has just happened. A real gift, a real grace. You feel that. And something that is perhaps the beginning of a much more profound and long-lasting healing. If I think, I'm on a jhana retreat, I want to catch up with the others or whatever it is, and I rush too quickly back to the samadhi intention, something hasn't been allowed to ripen. It needs, to me it sounded like it needed longer in that intention. Stay with the soul-making intention. That's what opened things up. Anyway, it's delivering something beautiful. It's delivering the piti and the gorgeousness, etc. And something is being healed. And something is also being ensouled. The dukkha is being ensouled. The energy body is being ensouled. Lots of things. Lots of things are happening that are really profoundly important. Maybe more important than whether I attain X jhana right now. Or even in the next months or whatever it is. So that was my brief encouragement in a note back. And I really think that's important. And I got a short response saying, thank you, wonderful, I'm so ready to put down the intention for samadhi. I don't know if I was hearing it right, but I was a little concerned getting that note that there's a difference making a choice. Okay, now I'm going to have a soul-making intention rather than a samadhi intention. We talked about the intention really being the primary thing that drives this or that practice, whether I'm navigating a fork in the road between insight ways of looking and samadhi, or soul-making and samadhi, or whatever it is. It's the intention that's really important for a number of reasons. But there's a difference between intention coming out of an aversion and a fed-upness, and an intention coming out of love and desire and a sense of grace and wanting something. Wanting something is different. Wanting soul-making is different than just really not wanting to be anymore with a certain intention for samadhi. So I'm not sure, and it was right at the end of the retreat, so I don't know, but I didn't get a chance to find out or respond. But I would just, and it may not be the case at all for this person, but I think my what I want to say right now is careful about these kind of choices. It's a different thing, and where there's been a habit of aversion, or making choices out of aversion, or getting so fed up with a certain situation or situations or how things are unfolding or not unfolding, that we feel a lot of aversion, frustration, and then the intention is coming out of that. That intention coming from aversion will have a different effect than an intention coming out of love for something, or eros for something, or responding to an invitation of an erotic beloved other. You understand? This is really, really important. And I would guess that they will unfold differently. You could say it was the same move, but the intention is slightly... I'm choosing the soulmaking intention over the samadhi intention, but the intention, the dominant intention, is slightly different. One is eros, and one is aversion. And that probably will make a difference. So as I said, I don't know if it's the case with this person, but the point bears making in a general way, because it applies very, very widely. So this is all part of getting wise to desire and eros and this whole territory. These meta questions are so, so important. How we respond to them, how we hold them, and how we choose in relationship to them. Okay. So that's all I wanted to add as sort of PS to the whole retreat. I hope some of that has been helpful or will be helpful at some point. Okay. Actually, one last thing I forgot. Someone was asking about resource, and I had mentioned from the beginning of the retreat and emphasized the ability of jhanas, our practice of jhanas, to really form and open up for us a profound resource of well-being in our life, and really stressing that their function, their potential function for us as deep resources. So just to elaborate on this a little bit and draw out some of the other things I've been saying, so to make something clear here, this person was asking. So yeah, if one only experiences a jhana, once or twice or a few times, it might be that shortly, for some period after those jhanic experiences, if they're strong or whatever, that there is a relatively short-lived sense of resource, of happiness, of well-being, of energy, etc. The kind of unshakability that might come with that, even from just feeling so happy or whatever it is. Excuse me. But the danger, as I think I've alluded to already on the retreat, the danger with only having jhanic experience a few times is that then it goes and it's not around, and it may become, through the memory, an object of attachment and duality with what we experience now compared to the jhanic experience. And then it's not really, it's run out of anything it's giving us as a resource. It's not providing anything as a resource, but even worse than that, it's actually fostering a sense of suffering through the duality, through the attachment to the memory, etc. Much more significant is when we are able to frequently practice and experience a jhanic state, perhaps every day or maybe a couple of times a day, whatever it is, in our busy lives, etc. Or maybe not even every day, but regularly enough that it functions as a more constant source, like a well that isn't going dry, and or a spring, and there's a sense of replenishment that it brings, of rejuvenation, of energy. The energy is being replenished, rejuvenated, and a deep emotional well-being that of different flavors and kinds, depending on what jhana we're talking about. But that deep emotional well-being allows us, or supports us, helps us to stay steady and to meet difficulties, to sustain our creative projects, the work that we're doing, when there is difficulty to sustain our service work, if that's what we're involved in, or activism, or whatever it is. Through the ups and downs, through the knocks, through the slog of that. And sometimes it might be, work that's not either well paid financially, or we're not getting any pats on the back for it, or recognition, or even no one else seems to notice. But this dipping in regularly, drinking from these wells, these beautiful springs of cool, clear water, will definitely provide resource in our life. But there's a second way that I want to emphasize, and actually, in a way, is implicit in stuff I said on the retreat, but I really want to draw it out to make it clear. Long-term, repeated immersion in and exposure to, jhanic states, let's say second jhana and above, I would say. Long-term repeated immersion and drinking from that, and suffusing the body in that, and dissolving and being absorbed in that. Long-term repeated practice of jhanas will open and deepen the sense we have of what a human being is, what we are as human beings, but also what other human beings are. It opens and deepens the very sense of the dimensionality of human beings. So our sense of our own being becomes dimensional. As I said near the beginning of the retreat, the jhanas become almost like dimensions of human being. They're also dimensions of being more generally, or cosmic being, especially as we go deeper into the jhanas, so that opening and deepening a sense of the dimensionality not just of our own being, and human being, but also of the cosmos. And it's this, at another, in addition to the way it worked as a resource I just described, is this opening up of the sense of dimensionality, that even if for some reason later in our life the jhanas are not accessible, maybe there's certain life situations where we're just not able to practice for some reason, maybe there's a severe illness, maybe there's medicine trying to treat a severe illness, and that medicine is having all kinds of difficult side effects and preventing clarity of mind, or preventing concentration, or preventing mental energy, or whatever it is. For whatever other reason, even when the jhanas become not accessible, they still function. Something has been seen and sensed and known by the being, by the chitta, so that they still function after all that time, and it could be years, as a resource. One senses still and knows something about one's own being, about human being, and about the cosmos. And that knowledge, if you like, if we call that sense of things, is there. Even if one can't touch it or see it right now. You understand? It's imprinted on the psyche, on the chitta, on the heart and mind so profoundly, and opened up and changed and dimensionalized the sense of things, that one knows it's true, and that even when one can't touch it anymore. And that knowledge acts as a long-term support for the chitta, for the soul. As I said, including when circumstances in one way or another may be very, very challenging. So there's two levels there, if you like, of the way in which jhanas can function as a really profound and helpful resource for our lives, and for meeting life and opening to life, and serving what we want to serve in life.
Thank you for listening. To learn how you can support the teachers and Dharma Seed, please visit dharmaseed.org/donate.